What's up, folks? Welcome back to another episode of All Things Baltimore Sports. I'm the host, Matt Trigger. We got a special episode tonight. This is a little bit of Ravens talk. This episode is brought to you by Grade 8's Memorabilia in Parkville, Maryland, in conjunction with Driving to the Top Productions podcasting network that I'm part of. My guest tonight is from the Locked On Ravens podcast. He is a writer for Ravens Wire. He is featured on Bleacher Report over the ensuing NFL seasons. Kevin Oestreicher, welcome back to the show, bud.
I appreciate you having me back, Matt. It's great to talk to you again. I know we're in a little bit of a lull period for the Ravens this offseason, but it feels like the NFL offseason honestly never ends. So we always have stuff to talk about.
Yes, we do. And I think the NFL has, in a genius way, stretched it to where they're never out of the news cycle. You know, you go from February at the end of the Super Bowl, obviously, and then March there's, the combine. Then April is the draft. May is mini camps and OTAs. June is OTAs, and then July you're right back in training camp. And before you know it, the 6-month grind is on. And a lot's been going on in Ravens, in Ravens Nation. Some good, some bad. We have a lot of unknowns heading into the season still, even after the draft. This week, it's been a slow news week, other than the fact that some people are still kind of reeling from the schedule release. So before I get on my soapbox and ramble, Kevin, what is your thoughts initially on the schedule release for 2024?
Yeah, there are always some really interesting quirks within the schedule. I mean, first of all, if we want to talk about a way the NFL did the Ravens pretty dirty, that 3-game and 10-day stretch is just absolutely brutal. I mean, you have the Giants, and then you go and play Pittsburgh on Saturday afternoon football, and then you go to Houston to play the Texans on Christmas. And that, to me, I mean, the Ravens are must-see TV. We know they're must-see TV. So 5 primetime games doesn't shock me. They're actually playing less 1 p.m. games this year than they are in the 4 o'clock or 8 o'clock window combined. It's, I think, 9 in the 4 or 8 window and only 8 1 p.m. games this season. So you have a lot of eyes that are going to be on Baltimore this season, but it's brutal to have that stretch, especially late in the season when we know injuries they're everywhere in football. They happen regardless whether you want them to or not. Now, Pittsburgh actually is dealing with the exact same thing at the exact same time. And actually, I'd rather have Baltimore scheduled than Pittsburgh's. I think Pittsburgh plays Philadelphia, they play Baltimore, then they play Kansas City in that 3-week stretch. So
that's definitely rough.
Yeah.
The schedule makers, we're always going to lambaste them for every little decision that we make, good or bad, that they decide. The 2 biggest discrepancies I got with the schedule this year is not just the 3 games in 10 days after our bye week, but leave Christmas alone if it's on a Wednesday. Like, I know it sounds nitpicky, but you're really stretching this out to where not only are you making it a must-see game against the Houston Texans, because that's a marquee matchup. CJ Stroud, the Texans made a lot of moves this offseason.
Yep.
They had a pretty good draft. But then it's like you put the previous game on a Saturday just so there's not a 3-day break, because you can't do that to them.
Yep.
But it just feels like it's very forced at this point that they're trying to monopolize Christmas, and now you're making it a Netflix-only type of situation, to where if you don't have that, Netflix isn't $6.99, $7.99, $9.99 anymore. It's almost $20 a month for the basic tier, and not everybody has that. And if you really sit down and think about it, NFL Thursday nights are on Amazon. You got games that are streamed exclusively on Peacock. Then you got games that are now going to be streamed exclusively on the Netflix app. ESPN has Monday Night Football, and they put some of their games on ESPN Plus. You got to pay for cable to watch your team, and then on top of that, you got to pay $150 a month in streaming services to watch football now.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I mean, we know the NFL, they love their money. I mean, there's no getting around that. And even if you want to go, and this is kind of related, kind of not, but when the NFL banned the hip drop tackle, obviously it's a big part of player safety in terms of the reason they did that. But you have all these other rules that are essentially legislating defense out of the game. So if it was just, oh, the hip drop tackle is banned, but you can tackle a guy this way or that way, I think it would have been more well received. But we saw outrage from a bunch of different people, especially former and current NFL defenders, about how we're supposed to tackle guys when they're legislating defense out of the game. Well, offense sells, right? So you can have a 3-0 game and people can say, oh, this is such a slop fest and this is such good defensive football. But people are going to turn it off because they say, oh, this is boring. Now, I wouldn't and you wouldn't, but other people who are just, maybe casual fans of the game might be, I don't want to watch this. I'd rather watch a game that's more high scoring. You want that Kansas City, Los Angeles game from a couple of years ago that was 50-49. That's what sells. The NFL schedule release, right? We didn't care a couple of years ago. It was just like, oh, okay, cool. They play this team then, and that's fine. And they play this many games. The NFL has turned it in to this huge event where all these social media teams are releasing. I mean, that also is for, you don't have to do all that, but you do because it puts eyes on the league. Talk about the draft. We knew who the first pick of that draft was for months. It was Caleb Williams, but it took the Bears 9 minutes to make their pick because you got to roll through the commercials. We knew who the Bears were taking. There was no question about it. So to me, in going back to the schedule, they could have put 2 other teams on Christmas and made the Ravens-Texans one of the premier primetime games of the season, right? Did you have to put Ravens-Tampa in primetime? I think if you wanted to put Ravens-Texans there instead, you could have. And maybe you make Tampa and Baltimore be a 1 p.m. game or a 4:25 game. But to have the Ravens play on Christmas 2 years in a row, let alone go on the road for Christmas 2 years in a row, that to me just feels like the NFL did really want to play to matchups and play to, oh, this is going to get as many eyes on the TV as we can. And, we can talk about it from our perspective, Matt, and like, oh, go in and everything. But for the players, it's like they have to be away from their families for the second Christmas in a row. And it's not as far as San Francisco, but it's not close. It's not anywhere close. So that's where I agree with you. I feel like they should have given Baltimore Christmas off, especially because they had them play last year. And that's just not fair to the players, the organization, or anybody within it.
And the thing is, last year, Christmas was on Monday, with it being a leap year, it's on Wednesday this year. But now you're looking at the fact that not only do the players have to play on Christmas for the second year in a row, like you just alluded to, now you're going to have 75,000 people away from their families in the middle of Christmas Day. And to me, that just sucks. Like,
yeah,
I know that Christmas is important in my household and it's important to my family, but now I know that this year, because of what I do with this show, I'm tuned into every game. I'm locked into every game because of how I cover it, and you are too. So you know what it's like. Now I'm gonna be glued to the television at 4:30 on Christmas Day, and it's like, really, guys, like you just can't leave it. They can't leave well enough alone. But the schedule, that sucks with the 3 games in 10 days, and the beginning of the year is kind of crazy. It's weeks 2 through 4, that's 3 games in 14 days right there as well. Like you said earlier, this league that preaches player safety is putting these guys in 60-minute car crashes multiple times in a 2-week period, which that's not good for the body. That's not good for anybody.
Yeah.
So it's definitely rough. And that first 5-week stretch for us in this year is very tough. Opening in Kansas City, we have Buffalo. I believe we have the Cincinnati Bengals in there. So we don't have any slouches until we reach Washington week 6.
And even I think too, I almost split it up into like 3 different subsections: beginning of the season, middle of the season, end of the season, because there are 3 stretches within that. You mentioned weeks 1 through 5. That's going to be crazy. And there's already been national media talk about how Baltimore is going to finish in those first 5 weeks last in the division. And it's all the haters are coming out of the woodwork already. But then you have a stretch from, I believe, week 7 to week 13. It starts with that Tampa game in week 7. And you have teams that are going to be super tough. I mean, even those first 5, right? You mentioned Kansas City to open the year. Then you have Las Vegas. You got Dallas in week 3, Buffalo week 4, and then the Bengals in week 5. 4-1 would be awesome in that stretch. I think 3-2 is probably the realistic option, but get off
It
to a
is.
strong start. And we know the Ravens love playing up to competition. We know they also play down to competition at times too. So they're going to be playing 10 playoff teams from last year. It's going to be a heck of a schedule, especially because you end the year with such a crazy one after the bye. And I know there's all this talk about, the Ravens have the most rest days in the league based off how the schedule is put together. But that doesn't, to me, necessarily nullify the fact that, you do have a couple of stretches early in the season where it's 3-14, as you talked about. And we obviously are making a big deal of the 3-10. So you have all those days to rest, and that's fine. But if you come out of that 3 games in 10-day stretch with a bunch of injuries, and those are season ending or multi-month, multi-week, it doesn't necessarily matter. You have all that time to rest because those guys are out for the count.
And you're absolutely right. And this dynamic for this team is different this year as well, Kevin, where last year we were around this time we were worried about, does Odell Beckham Jr. still have it? Now the question turns to, is Derrick Henry fool's gold? And you hear about that dreaded 30-year-old season. I hope it continues with the stretch of former Titans coming to Baltimore and having great first years in the name of Samari Rolle and Steve McNair and Derek Mason, those type of guys. I would love for him not to have to worry about Henry. We're not going to see Keaton until around that week 14 bye, unless he has a miraculous recovery. So it's really Derrick Henry, Justice Hill, and Rasheen Ali. So that's not that doesn't strike fear into you because Derrick Henry's not 25 years old right now in his prime. He's we don't know if he's going to hit that wall or not. So that's definitely worrisome with that schedule. But we also have other instances on this roster where you don't have Jadeveon Clowney. You don't have Ronald Darby. You don't have Rock Ya-Sin. You don't have Geno Stone. All these guys are gone. And we haven't replaced all these guys with what many Ravens fans deem to be adequate veteran replacements for the guys that were lost. We're going more towards the draft. We drafted Nate Wiggins in the first round. We drafted Rosengarten in the second round to replace Morgan Moses. That's on the offensive side of the ball. But the defense looks a lot different. Even though you might see a lot of the same names, the depth isn't necessarily there with the veterans. We're going to be expecting a lot out of Jalen Armour-Davis and Pepe Williams to really fill those roles that we've been expecting them to fill for the better part of the last 2 years. So it's definitely a different feel knowing that the team that we were worried about last year went 13-4.
It's so true. I mean, we knew, and I kind of had this inkling, the Ravens were going to lose a bunch of guys in free agency. I mean, they just could not retain everybody with how good they were. And that honestly extends to the coaching staff too, in their personnel department, where they lost a bunch of guys. I mean, there was really no rest for the Ravens because literally less than a week after, a couple days after they lost that AFC Championship game, Mike McDonald was out the door. So they've had a bunch of losses, but instead of replacing them with veteran after veteran after veteran, they've gone with a bit of a youth movement here. And this isn't just at one position, it's at multiple, where you lose Patrick Queen. They obviously drafted his replacement last year in Trenton Simpson. I think they understood the writing was on the wall with that one, especially with the fifth-year option declined. With Ronald Darby and Rock Ya-Sin, they draft Nate Wiggins and TJ Tampa. You're expecting those guys to come in and maybe play a role. But, as you mentioned, Jalen Armour-Davis, Pepe Williams, some of those other guys are also going to have to come in if they even want a roster spot and have a really good training camp in preseason. On the offensive line, losing 3 starters is tough, even just for continuity's sake. Kevin Zeitler was solid as they come for a guard. Moses was pretty solid as well, I'd say, just, overall. But the projected line right now, I think Andrew Voorhees, a lot of people expect to win that left guard spot, Ben Cleveland to win the right guard spot, and Rosengarten has talked about to replace Moses. It's going to take some time for those guys to get acclimated. And then you also mentioned on the defensive line where Travis Jones, I think, is going to take on a bigger role in the edge room with Jadeveon Clowney not there. Does that mean they're going to rely on David Ojabo a bunch more this year? Can he stay healthy this year is a big question. And obviously in their secondary, losing Geno Stone, they have no safety depth right now. Kyle Hamilton and Marcus Williams are your guys and in your set at your starter positions. But after 5 very healthy years in New Orleans, Marcus Williams has come to Baltimore and had 2 very serious injuries in 2 years, and they don't have that insurance policy of Geno Stone anymore. And we'll talk about, I'm sure, at some point, Matt Jamal Adams and, the safety depth and positions, but they need at least one other guy because their safety depth right now outside of their 2 stars is their 7th rounder in Sanusi Kane and an undrafted guy from Maryland, Bo Braid. And while they could turn out to be something, doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. So they're going to need a bunch of young guys to step up this year, whereas last year it just kind of felt like they signed a bunch of veterans for plug-and-play options.
They did. And, there's another guy that's been hanging around the team fringe practice squad, bottom of the 53 man, and that's our Darius Washington. Yeah, and
true.
Do we finally get a healthy year out of him? He was hyped up to be a very good undrafted free agent. A lot of draft experts, I remember a couple of years ago that they were expecting him to go anywhere from the 5th to the 7th round, and he fell completely out of the draft. Bo Braid is a local kid. He's going to have a chance to make this roster. When it comes to Jamal Adams, you and I talked a little bit pre-show. I'm a sucker for names. I was a sucker for Jadeveon Clowney. I'm a toot my own horn. I ended up being right because I said Jadeveon Clowney was going to have a monster year here. I didn't think he was going to have that much of a monster year to where he goes and gets a $20 million contract from the Carolina Panthers, which I'm happy for him. He's going home.
Yeah.
And, we have a lot of holes that we have to fill, and Jamal Adams doesn't really fit that hole that Geno Stone left. If you were telling me that we were trying to replace Chuck Clark, Jamal Adams, okay, I understand it. Me personally, I would like us to kick the tires on Jordan Poyer potentially. I know he's a little bit older, but he fits that Geno Stone mold as opposed to Jamal Adams. Jamal Adams doesn't play deep. He's essentially a linebacker at this point in his career. He has a very limited range. And are you going to give this guy $3 or $4 million to be available for 7 games?
It's a good point because the injury history's been there. I mean, one of the calling cards for Jamal Adams is, look, at the end of the day, when he was in New York in his prime, his first year in Seattle when he got traded over there, the name of the game for him was play him up at the line, play him in the box. He can blitz off the edge, blitz up the middle, and he can lead your team in sacks. Like, that's how good he was at doing that. But he hasn't had a sack in 3 years. He hasn't had a sack since that 2020 season. No sacks in 2021, no sacks in 2022, no sacks in 2023. Only played in 1 game 2 years ago, I believe 9 or 12 last season, but he's had a bunch of injuries. Now, to your point about, the skill set, I agree. Baltimore needs what they need to prioritize is replacing Geno Stone. Part of the reason why Baltimore's secondary and defense was so good last season was because when Marcus Williams went down, there was essentially a 1-for-1 trade-off. There wasn't any drop-off when it came to Geno Stone coming in and playing his game, whereas he was playing far above replacement level. And that was even when Marlon went down. Ronald Darby came in and they didn't miss a beat. Brandon Stevens played great number 1 corner for them for a long time. So it was about guys stepping up. I'm not saying that, the younger guys are just automatically can't do it because they're rookies, but I'd be shocked if they were to. For Baltimore, this is every year, and Robert Griffin III said this today. Every year is a Super Bowl or bust year for the Ravens at this point because you're wasting year of Lamar Jackson's prime if you don't get it done. And You have to be able to build a contender and be able to navigate the veteran signings while also developing for the future. And that's the tough balance there DeCosta and the people in the Ravens organization have to do. And I think they've done it pretty well. But if you're bringing in Jamal Adams and another guy, like if you say, all right, Jamal Adams is going to be a dime backer for us, maybe look in the role of Patrick Queen, because the Ravens, they did a lot last year. They weren't going to take Roquan and Patrick Queen off the field for extended snaps. They're one of the few teams that had 2 starting really good inside linebackers. And so you didn't have to take Queen off of the field because he was doing so much for that defense. And now with him gone, Trent Simpson, I'm a big Simpson believer. I think he's going to have a good year, but you're not obligated to keep him on the field because he hasn't proven that, oh yeah, he's a 3-down player at this point. You can move him around too. But if you want to put Adams in there and then go out there and sign a Justin Simmons or Eddie Jackson or one of those types who fits the Geno Stone mold, and your safety room is Hamilton, Williams, Jamal Adams, and one of those Geno Stone replacements, I'm okay with that. But if your plan for the Ravens is just to bring in Adams, part of the reason that you need the skill set of Geno Stone is because it allows Kyle Hamilton to move around and be Kyle Hamilton. If you bring in Jamal Adams, Hamilton's going to be relegated to a too high safety role, very limited in what he's able to do. And then Adams is your roamer. I'd much rather have Kyle Hamilton as your roamer and have another guy to fit the Geno Stone mold. 3 safety rotations is so important in today's league. And Pittsburgh went through this a lot with Minkah Fitzpatrick last year, where they didn't have enough safety depth. They had to relegate Minkah Fitzpatrick to a specific role, and he didn't get to play his game. I don't want to see the Ravens have to do that with Kyle Hamilton because he's just such a dynamic player.
I agree with you. There's a name that you mentioned, and you shared it on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. I believe it was earlier today. Bleacher Report mentioned that Marlon Humphrey is one of the most overrated cornerbacks heading into the 2024 season. He took exception to it. You shared the article, but you clearly stated that you didn't believe that. If they cannot find anybody to fit that free safety, third safety mold, I'm not opposed to it because of his age and his range now. You can move Marlon theoretically to that too high safety look back there with Marcus. Marlon can still tackle, and he's a veteran in the secondary. It could be a Charles Woodson type of situation where he was a lockdown corner for so long, but now that he's getting a little long in the tooth, he's pushing towards his 30th birthday. You could maybe start to transition and ease him into that third safety role while still having him as your starting nickel back in your base defense, because most defenses now are base in nickel. So you could theoretically do that if you can't find anybody to take on that role capably, because that would open up a situation to where you could go add another veteran cornerback that gets cut during training camp, or you throw grease on the fire and you tell Jalen Armour-Davis or Pepe, like, hey, get your shit together. You're the dime back at this point, because we do have Arthur Millette. We gave him a 2-year contract extension. I thought that was a fantastic move. He's more of a box cornerback, line of scrimmage, blitzing kind of guy. But there's a lot of interchangeable pieces. Like you said, you need to have Kyle Hamilton being able to pretty much be the joker of this defense and play. He's a positionless football player. He can play anywhere that you need him to, other than with his hand in the dirt over the center.
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to try that with Kyle Hamilton. I think
No.
what they've done with him has been great, and I'm interested to see too. I mean, they tried the corner to safety thing with Jimmy Smith a while ago. That was a little later in his career, where they at least experimented with playing him in some sort of a safety role. So I think for Marlon, what I'm more curious about is, do they view him as purely an outside guy with the ability to play in the slot, or do they want to move him into more of a hybrid type of role where they can play him on the outside and put him in the slot? Because you mentioned the interchangeability of the defense. I mean, you have Millette, who you mentioned. Hamilton obviously did a great job in the slot last year as well. Humphrey, we know, can be an elite slot player too. And in terms of Marlon being the most overrated defensive back, Bleacher Report said that last year was pretty disappointing because of the injuries and everything that he went through. I think his coverage slipped a little bit last season. How much was that impacted by the injuries? Obviously, we don't know. But 2022, he was awesome. He was great in 2022. Now, he's not, I think a couple of years ago, everybody had him in like top 5 status, and that really wasn't a question. Like, everybody's, Marlon's an all pro top 5 guy. There's no question. I think for me, his play over the last year or so has maybe moved him into like top 10-ish, top 15-ish. But I don't think, to me, that's like, oh, he's a terrible player. He has to have a big year this year. I think this is a big year for Marlon in terms of his contract is getting a little expensive, and whether that's a restructure or figuring out his future. They do draft Nate Wiggins in the first round this year, so is that maybe a little glimpse into the Ravens' future cornerback room? But at the same token, Brandon Stevens does not have an extension at the time of this stream, so who knows when that's going to happen. But I think Marlon is one of the more intriguing players on the Ravens because he's super physical. He embodies what the Ravens like in their defense, which is super physical defensive backs who can get active in the run game. And we saw them transition, even though Rock Ya-Sin didn't work out. his skill set was so much different than Marcus Peters, because Marcus was kind of that ball hawking, skinnier player that shied away from contact a little bit. Rocky Yassin was a wrestler, did his thing. Like he was physical, even though it didn't work out. So for Marlon, coverage wise, I think I'd like to see a bit more consistency based off what we saw last season. But does that mean a different type of a role for him? That to me is the big storyline.
It is. I want to see them utilize him properly, just like everybody else on the defense. As a matter of fact, a lot of it's going to have to do with, what Eric does in the late June, early July months where we're gearing up. This Jamal Adams thing could be pure smokescreen. Obviously he got out of town today without a deal. I think if they wanted him, they would have probably inked him after the contract. They were probably just seeing what the guy had left in the tank at this point in his career. Like you said, he's been derailed by injuries significantly over the last couple of years. And another position of worry is we didn't do anything to address edge early in the draft. I don't know if you consider Isaac a early pick or not, but we brought back Kyle Van Noy. I was a huge Van Noy, I was on that train for him to come back after the year that he had for us. The guy came off the couch in the middle of September and gave us 9 sacks. I mean, you can't really ask for much more than that, Kevin. That's incredible work for a veteran who's been well traveled throughout the league now. A couple stints in New England, Miami, Detroit. The guy's well traveled in the NFL, and he just came in here, picked up the defense, and he was an absolute force on that edge.
One of the things I loved about Kyle Van Noy last year was he surprised me not only with his physicality in the run game. I thought, Jadeveon Clowney comes in. We know who Jadeveon Clowney was coming in. Elite run defender. There were questions about the pass rush, and he obviously proved last year that the pass rush is still there. But for Van Noy, he was kind of the where is his role going to be? But he was super physical and getting active in the run game, but also just seemed like every time there was a big play made by Baltimore's defense, a big sack on third down, a big tackle short of the sticks, like it was Van Noy who was doing it. And he was a big, I called him the clutchest player on the defense in 2023. And there were a lot of guys who were up for that award. I mean, you could name a bunch of them, but I thought that Van Noy did an incredible job. So I thought that it was unrealistic they were going to be able to bring both back. I kind of projected Van Noy would be more likely to come back over Clowney just because I thought Clowney would have more options. I think Van Noy is more of a specific player to what Baltimore needed, and I think they could try to replace Clowney in a bunch of different ways. But the edge position is a little concerning to me just because of Van Noy, is set. You don't have any problems with Van Noy. Odafe Owe, he's been solid, right? He's been a solid player, but we need that. If you're the Ravens, you're saying we need that big year 4 leap. We need you to go out there and produce for us and break double-digit sacks and do that. But the big question mark to me is David Ojabo. I think they're betting a lot on David Ojabo this year to come in, be healthy, and play a full 17 games or at least close to it. But in 2 years, the first one obviously was at his pro day, so you're not chalking that up to playing in the NFL. But the second year with the partially torn ACL, the thing with Ojabo is he's shown a bunch of potential. When he's been on the field, he's had production. It's been there, forced fumbles, sacks, but it's just him staying on the field. And I think a lot of people are, at least over the past couple of years, starting to worry, is this a J.K. Dobbins trend where when he's healthy, he's productive, but when he's not, the injuries are just too rampant for him. So it's a big third year for David Ojabo. Adisa Isaac is a player that, I'd consider that probably a mid-round pick to the point where I'm not expecting a big role for him early on. I honestly probably expect Tavius Robinson to take on a big role in year 2. And he had a pretty big role for them last year. I was pretty surprised by that. I wouldn't be shocked if they brought in another edge guy, but they're already pushing their roster at this point. If I had to do a roster projection, I'd probably have Malik Ham off of the roster just because I'd assume them to keep 5 guys instead of 6. If they kept 6, Ham would be on the roster. But if you bring in a veteran, then you're keeping 6 edge guys. It's a tough tightrope to walk if you're at Costa because you need a bunch of offensive linemen, a bunch of members in your secondary. So how many guys on the edge / defensive line can you keep? It's going to be a big question.
Yeah, it spoke volumes to me last year, and I said this during the season as well. The fact that you bring in Jadeveon Clowney at the end of training camp, where he essentially missed all of training camp, he got acclimated and he was a starter week 1. And Van Noy comes off the couch. I believe he got here week 4.
Yeah.
And by mid-year, they were taking more reps than Oweh in starting roles. And I'm not saying Oweh fell off or anything, because I believe he had 6.5 sacks in reserve duty. But you're a first round draft pick, my man. That's one of those situations where that's not clicking to me, that you let a 34 and a 33-year-old, old guys, so to speak, come in here and take a lot of your reps. So, like you said, this needs to be Oweh's year where he has an 11 or 12 sack season, because you can't rely, even though we gave Matabike a ton of money, and I'm so happy we did. He earned it. But you can't anticipate Matabike to have another 13 sack season. So the sack production has got to come from somewhere. And like you said, they're putting a lot of their eggs in Ojabo's basket right now. And you don't even know if Ojabo's going to be healthy to start the year. All signs point to yes, because we haven't heard otherwise. But now you got Ojabo, where 2 straight years it's been an Achilles tear and it's been a partially torn ACL. So this is that year where you got to decide, is this going to be a situation where we let him play his contract out and we, say thank you? Or is this something to where this is going to be that breakout caliber kind of year for him? So it's a lot of questions in that part of the defense. I don't have a whole lot of a worry about Trenton Simpson. Like you said earlier, we drafted him for the inevitability of losing Patrick Queen. And I think that he's bigger, stronger, and faster than Patrick Queen. Only thing Patrick Queen has over him is obviously his years of experience. But if you put somebody that's that athletic next to Roquan Smith, I believe you'll get similar production of a Patrick Queen in the form of Trenton Simpson.
Yeah, I think, there's going to be some sort of a learning curve. And I mean, we saw that with Patrick Queen too, and it's a little different because Queen came in during that 2020 COVID year where there were no in-person workouts, no in-person rookie camp. Everything was virtual. And I think that was really tough for that entire 2020 class. So it took a couple of years and some change for Patrick Queen to really show his stuff. And that was to be expected after, he didn't really start a ton at LSU, didn't have a ton of experience there in terms of just a pure starting center of the defense type of role. But for Trenton Simpson, he's had a year to kind of just take it all in, be behind Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen, learn from both of those guys. And it's really interesting because both he and Malik Harrison have edge experience where you can put them on the edge. We talk about positionless defense and everybody moving around. I feel like you could do a little bit of that, and maybe a guy like Harrison gets some extended run earlier. You put Simpson on the edge, and then you can move guys around. But to me, it was important for the Ravens to at least go out there and get depth. They bring back Chris Board, who I think that was probably John Harbaugh's favorite signing of the offseason, considering he's a big special teams guy and Board is a big special teams guy. But Simpson is a player that intrigued me. I mean, everybody saw it in week 18 of last year where he put on a clinic against Pittsburgh and showed why Baltimore drafted him. He is that sideline to sideline player that Patrick Queen was. He has that skill set. He can be great in coverage. And I think that's one of the areas Queen struggled in a little bit, to the point where I think Simpson is an upgrade in that way, but I do think experience matters. And we've seen a bunch of interesting situations over the course of Baltimore's franchise history where we'll think this rookie's going to have a huge role or this second-year player is going to have a huge role, and then a veteran. Like, for example, DJ Fluker wins the starting right guard job or right tackle job a couple years ago. Whenever I can't remember the player who was supposed to win it, but DJ Fluker was the surprise winner of that competition after all season.
I think it was Tyree Phillips.
That is who it was. That's exactly who it was. And everybody thought it was going to be Tyree Phillips, and DJ Fluker comes out and wins it. And everybody, Phillips had the better camp. Phillips did this, Phillips did that, but they went with experience. So it's why it's a little shocking the Ravens have gone so young at some of their positions and are relying on that experience, because we saw so many vets come in last offseason, but it is just the nature of having a quarterback on that massive contract. And it's not just Lamar. I mean, they have a bunch of bigger contracts. You mentioned Matabike, and they're going to have to pay Linderbaum and Kyle Hamilton down the line. If Zay continues what he's doing, they're going to have to pay him too. So it's about maximizing your roster, maximizing your assets. Baltimore only has about $6 million in cap space left. They could restructure some guys. They could do a couple things to free it up. But Simpson's one of those guys who, and especially, I think the inside linebacker position is the running back position of the defense, whereas it's getting devalued a bit more because we're seeing a bunch of box safeties and not a lot of teams playing two inside linebackers a bunch. So how much are you really willing to pay? And I think we saw that during the offseason when people were projecting Patrick Queen to get 70, 80, $90 million in total, and he only got 42. So, I mean, Patrick Queen got his money. I'm happy for him that he got his money. Obviously, the team was not ideal for where he went for Baltimore fans. But I think Trenton Simpson will be more than fine in this defense when we talk about him at the end of the season.
I truly believe that the Roquan Smith effect is going to be similar to the Ray Lewis effect. I'm not comparing Ray and Roquan because there's really nobody on God's green earth that can do what Ray Lewis did at such a high level.
Yeah.
And I love Roquan Smith to death, but he might be one of the best middle linebackers in football right now, but it's debatable that he'll be considered among the all-time greats. But I can see Roquan Smith having the impact to where whoever's playing inside next to him is going to look an awful lot better than when they're now the guy at their next destination. You saw it with Ed Hartwell. You saw it with Bart Scott to a degree. He had a good year or two in New England. In New York, you saw it with Adalius Thomas. You saw it with Jameel McLean. You saw it with a lot of these guys, Donnell Ellerby. A lot of these guys left thinking that they were going to have that similar production. And when they went to be the focal point of that defense, wherever they signed, they had a huge fall off. I know it's a very, very small sample size, Kevin, and I know you know that as well. But Simpson started week 18 against Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And he had almost 20 tackles combined. And the dude was a madman on the field. He was playing like he knew that it was his job next year. So if you can get that next to Patrick Queen, I'm excited for the prospect of that him being next to Roquan. But transitioning to the offense, like we talked about the offensive line, we're gonna have 3 out of 5 new starters. I believe Voorhees, like you said, he's gonna be penciled in at one of those guard positions. Whether it's left or right remains to be seen. I think they'll probably keep Voorhees. Just out of my opinion, you will put Voorhees next to Stanley as kind of like that veteran, mentorship, because Ben Cleveland, I believe he's entering his 4th year now.
Yeah, this will be 4 for him.
This would be 4 for Cleveland. So he's not a youngster in terms of like a year 1 or year 2 guy, but he's not quite like that 8 or 9 year veteran yet. He should be the front runner to win right guard with, Fala kind of, being in that background. Lele, he should be in contention for right tackle, even though I believe it's going to go to Rosengarten. I believe that Falele is probably a project right side of the line guy. So the line's always going to be in question, but if they can remain cohesive and those guys can step into Cleveland played well in spot duty last year, at least in my opinion. When Zeitler went down and when Simpson went down with injuries, he filled in admirably, but we weren't, I wasn't cussing and yelling his name when he was in this year. The wide receiver room, we haven't really talked about. That had a lot of turnover. We signed Deontay Hardy, a local guy from Archbishop Curley. Zay's returning. No Devin Duvernay, no Odell Beckham Jr. We brought back Nelson Aguilar. We drafted Tez Walker from North Carolina, which looks to be a solid draft pick. And we signed Kadri Ismail's son, Kadir, to the 90-man roster this morning. So what's the outlook with the wide receiver room just in terms of, seeing it through the eyes of Kevin Oestreicher?
Yeah, it's another youth movement to me where you're essentially relying on Rashad Bateman to be your number 2. And I mean, that's fine if you have the belief, and the Ravens certainly showed they did. I think that was the plan all along. Where last year, there was always a question, it felt like, of who really was the number 2 receiver. Was it Odell? Was it Rashad Bateman? It never really felt like we got a clear answer on that. And I almost can bet Rashad Bateman was almost looking over his shoulder a little bit. And it's like, well, every week, what's my role going to be? Well, this week, am I going to get enough targets this week? And Beckham, I mean, not that either of them had great stat lines every single game. It felt like it was always 3 for 27, 2 for 19, like some of those stat lines. But we know that Bateman has the skill set. He's a great route runner. And I think that it's just been injuries that have set him back. He and Lamar have never really had a full offseason to fully connect with each other. But other than that, Baltimore didn't go out there and add a crazy amount of anything else. Nelson Aguilar being brought back, I liked that move. I thought he was really good for them last season as a veteran presence. I essentially thought they chose between Aguilar and Odell, and I think that was the right decision. I think Aguilar brought a lot to them. Deontay Hardy's probably going to have some level of a role on offense, but he was primarily brought in to be a special teams guy, and the Ravens knew, kick returner, punt returner, that's what he excels at. But then you have Tez Walker. And when we talk about the receivers and what, at least last year, and their skill sets, they didn't really have that like bigger body jump ball contested catch guy. And Tez Walker certainly is that. He's drawn comparisons to Torrey Smith with the speed he has as well. And then, I mean, as an undrafted guy, talk about Kadir, who's 6'6" and is just a monster. Talk about big body player. Kadir Ismail is definitely that. So if I had to bet on if the Ravens keep an undrafted receiver, which one of those guys, I'd probably put my bet on Kadir. It's a great story. And hopefully, quarterback from Villanova goes to Stanford and balls out. So to me, I think that the odd man out here, the one I'm interested to see what his preseason and training camp looks like, is Tylan Wallace. Obviously had the big return, and that's going to be cemented in Ravens history against the Rams to win them that game in overtime. But, hasn't really shown a lot as a receiver over his time in the NFL. I don't think he's gotten a shot to do it, honestly. It feels like there's been a bunch of guys in front of him, and he hasn't been able to show his skill set off. But if they bring in a veteran or if one of these undrafted guys goes crazy, my philosophy is always 6 wide receivers is the perfect amount. 7 is a little too many. 5 is a little too little. And so if you keep 6 guys, obviously Flowers, Bateman, Aguilar, Devontae Walker, Deontay Hardy, Tylan Wallace, these are 6. But if one of those undrafted guys ends up balling out and you can't let him go, it feels like Tylan Wallace will be the odd man out.
And that's unfortunate because Tylan Wallace he offers a lot in the special teams department, obviously, not just as a return man, but he was a gunner. He's been on a punt block team. So he has his value. And I know Harbaugh emphasizes special team value immensely.
Yeah.
Kadir's interesting because, like you just said, he's a 6'6" wide receiver. We haven't really had a lot of those big boys hanging around lately, the last couple seasons. So that's a interesting aspect right there. If he makes a team, that'll be the second year in a row that a second generation Raven makes the squad. Keaton Mitchell last year with his father Anthony, who's a good friend of the show. He's a friend of mine, and it would be interesting to see Kadir compete in camp this year. I know we're looking forward to that. I think that he's going to give this wide receiver room a run for their money just based on, I'm putting it on pedigree of who he is. And the wide receiver room is open because you may have faith in Bateman as a 2, but I don't think that 2 is locked down the way that he might think it is, and that some Ravens fans my thing is. I don't have a personal problem with Bateman. I just think that he's childish in some of the way that he's handled adversity and controversy with the team. But the biggest thing to me that stood out in all this, and I know I might be nitpicking with this, Kevin, but when we have our first set of mini camps and your $53 million quarterback is walking through the door and you're posting workout videos on Instagram at a different location, this is where you build your rapport with your quarterback. This, showing up to the facility and working out with the team under team guidance is what you want. You don't want all that going on where you have all these guys coming in, you got your rookie class coming in, and Rashad Bateman's in a resistance band on your screen sprinting. Get to Baltimore, kid. Get it up with Lamar. You even admitted yourself that your injuries and the circumstances have held you back from creating a rapport with your quarterback. This is where you do it. You do it in April and May and June. And then by July, you're transitioning into the stretch much easier of training camp.
Right. And I think that for the Ravens, I mean, I'm not gonna, hold it over anybody's head if they don't decide to show up, because it is voluntary. And if it was mandatory and he wasn't showing up, then that'd be a whole other issue. But I do agree, where any time that you have an opportunity to go in, work at the facility, work with your quarterback, I think it's of benefit to you to go. And so if I were the team, the way I see it right now is I would prefer everybody to be there. But if some of these guys have their own workout routines and they're doing their own thing, and since it is voluntary, they have that right. Now, again, I would prefer them to be there. I'm not saying I didn't, but he had that right, so I'll let him exercise that and say, what, if that's what he wants to do, that's what he wants to do. But in my personal, I'm sure in the teams too, right? The team probably wants everybody there, but since it's voluntary, not mandatory, you got to live with some of those vets not showing up. Not everybody does, but I think Bateman's such a curious case because of the potential he has. Obviously, him being a first-round wide receiver gives him a bit more pressure when it comes to producing, and we just haven't seen the consistent production from him. This will be year 4 for him, the 5th-year option thing, which is really crazy, honestly, how it got voided and he had to sign that extension, which the deal itself is really good for the Ravens. But the risk in this is it's not like 2022 where you essentially thrust him into that wide receiver 1 role and said, hey, go do this. We knew that if he went down or if it didn't work, they were not going to be in a good position. And both him and Duvernay went down. It was just over at that point. But this year you have the insurance of Zay Flowers being Zay Flowers and Bateman being a 2 and Aguilar coming in and being an insurance policy as well if something happens. So it feels better than 2022. But there certainly is a risk in what they're doing. But I'm hoping Bateman can turn it around and really start the upward ascension of his career this year.
Yeah, I don't want to allude to the talking head on the 2 to 6 slot on the Fan, but Jason Lockenfora made a pretty decent point a couple weeks ago, and I hate giving this man his credit because he makes my blood boil sometimes. But he said that this extension for Bateman is a win-win for the Ravens, that if it doesn't work out in year 1 of this extension, his cap number is low enough to where you can trade him and still get something for him in the event that this doesn't work. And it's a terrible way to look at it in some aspects, but he was right. And this is the year where Bateman needs to show that you're the number 2 guy. Obviously, Zay Flowers is wide receiver 1. He proved that all year long. Controversy aside, the kid is very talented, and I hope that he builds off of an impressive rookie year. He's worked with Lamar all off season. He's, dedicated himself to being an elite receiver. He's training with elite receivers. So I believe that Zay training with Tyreek Hill might have the same effect of Justin Madubuike training with Aaron Donald, to where you're going to finally make this click and that you're going to see that next level elite play. But we haven't even talked about the tight end room, which is honestly on offense probably the most secure room in the entire offensive side of the ball. Obviously, Mark Andrews is tight end 1. Isaiah likely is going to be a star in this league, and I hope to God that it is here in Baltimore for a very long time. Charlie Kohler is a very serviceable tight end. I lump Patrick Ricard in there with them, more so than the running back room. But that whole group right there, I'm not even worried about them. I think likely is going to have a much bigger part in this offense this year, when he proved, and when Mark Andrews got hurt, that likely can carry the load as the starting tight end for this football team.
They have to find a way to utilize both those guys on the field at the same time. We've seen now the past 2 seasons, Mark Andrews goes down with an injury, Isaiah likely steps up and gives them essentially tight end 1 production, and it's been incredible. Now, the good thing about both of these guys, Andrews and Likely, is you can line them up anywhere. You can put them in the slot. You can put them on the outside. And that gives you so many different ways to utilize them. But using them in line together is also, it's somewhat uncomfortable for them to do in some aspects, because you want to have as many of your wide receivers out there. I mean, the NFL is moving to like 3 wide, 4 wide, like all this different stuff. But Baltimore has gone away from the grain for multiple seasons where everybody's being an air raid offense and throwing the ball 40, 50 times a game, where the Ravens have been a run first team and they've been pounding the ball, and that's what they've been doing. So for me, if you can utilize them the right way, and I've said this on a couple different shows now, but for me, if the Ravens do it the right way, I believe that in national circles, my bold prediction is that both Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely will be nationally received as top 10 tight ends, because Likely is that good, and we already know Andrews is that good too. Now, they have to do it the right way. You can't limit Likely in his role because Andrews is there. You have to find a way to get them on the field at the same time together in a lot of different sets, and we've seen that, but I think they're still trying to figure it out because Likely has taken this huge leap and has ascended so much to the point where you can't keep him off the field for long periods of time because he's that good. Mark Andrews is one of the best middle of the field workers in the league. Isaiah Likely is doing the exact same thing. Plus, he has that element of speed and deep aspect to him. Plus, with the play action game with Derrick Henry now, you bring in those 2 tight end sets with Patrick Ricard out there as well. You work play action off of that, and you essentially have 2 huge wide receivers in line that you can work off of. So that to me is a really important aspect too.
It's an insanely important aspect, and like you just said, you cannot take Likely off the field. Likely proved that he can produce, and now you got to figure out how to use Andrews and Likely simultaneously. I think I'm not trying to sound rude when I say this, but the Mark Andrews injury might have been one of the greatest things that ever happened to Lamar Jackson, because Mark Andrews was his security blanket. And at what point was Lamar Jackson going to start looking at other people other than 89?
We had this conversation a bunch too back when it was Mark Andrews and Marquise Brown, where it felt like every week it was either Marquise was getting 10 targets, 8 catches, or it was Mark Andrews getting 10 targets, 8 catches, and nobody else was doing anything. That was it. But I think that when you talk about Andrews going down, it did force Lamar Jackson to look other places. And I think we saw that starting off at that NFC South stretch, Tampa and New Orleans 2 years ago, where Andrews went down, and you saw him start to spread the ball out a bunch. And I think that has honestly helped him in terms of just being able to not be so laser focused. I mean, you want to get the ball to Mark Andrews. Andrews is super talented. The connection they have can't be replicated. It's not like you want to phase Andrews out of the offense or anything or like lose him. But the fact that he has had those experiences without him has shown him that, yeah, you know what? It doesn't all have to be force the ball to Mark Andrews all the time. And we kind of saw the same thing with Zay a little bit last year, where he was forcing the ball to Zay a little bit, or at least Monken was forcing the ball to Zay, especially in those trick play situations early in the season. And that's going to be it, where this is year 2 of Todd Monken's offense. So I'm not expecting as big of a runway. I'm expecting him to get into it a little quicker this season. Still working with new personnel, getting Derrick Henry acclimated, getting the offensive line, the new guys acclimated as well. But I'd expect them to hit the ground running a little faster than they did last season, which again, last year was natural. You know, new offensive coordinator, guys learning each other, but you've been together with most of this offense for a year, so I'd expect them to be able to utilize their guys better and more, at least faster this season.
That leads me to the next question for you. I know we're kind of working, you know, from the bottom up in terms of the offense. Derrick Henry, we talked about him a little bit earlier. We're still talking about him a little bit now. He's got a lot of mileage on those legs. You know, he essentially in the amount of time that he's played football at Alabama and Tennessee, he's only essentially had 2 years where he wasn't ridden like a workhorse, and that was his freshman year and I believe his rookie year in the NFL. And it seems like he's taken a lot of wear and tear. I know the dude's an insane freak of nature athlete where he's training, he keeps his body in peak physical condition. He's an NFL middle linebacker that runs the ball very well. So this is a different dynamic for us because now you have arguably the first heavy ground and pound running back that Baltimore has had since Jamal Lewis. And I know I'm taking it back 20 years with Jamal. We all love Jamal. At least, you know, OG Ravens fans love Jamal. This adds a different layer to the offense, obviously. Derrick Henry, as long as Derrick Henry can stay healthy and we don't feed him the ball 385 to 400 times, you got to respect Henry when he's on the field. You got to respect Lamar when he's on the field. And now you got a 305-pound fullback that's going to be blocking for a 255-pound running back. And it's a whole different dynamic to where now I think the pressure is off Lamar to throw the way that it was for him last year because he's lost the weight. He's not walking around at 230 anymore. He's back down to that 205, 210 range, which a lot of people are skeptical because when he was that small, he was getting hurt, but he got hurt in the pocket on freak hits. It was a blind side. I was at the game against Denver when he got hurt, and then he got hurt in the pocket against Buffalo, but that's neither here nor there. Lamar's not going to need to run nearly as much this year, but he's going to have the ability to where he can take off because as long as 22 is on the field, it's going to be crazy. So
Right.
It's a whole different level to the offense now.
Yeah, I agree. And it's almost like yin and yang with Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry. And I think defenses are going to have to find the perfect personnel to put on the field, because if you put pure heavy personnel out there, we know Lamar Jackson can shoot those guys out of their shoes, get to the edge, get to the outside, and make them look silly, especially at the reported weight and the speed that he is going to be probably gaining back by losing it. But then you try to get the speed and try to stop Lamar with a bunch of speedsters, and we know Derrick Henry can just bowl those guys over and run right through them. So defense are going to have to adjust a bunch to this offense. And you mentioned the Patrick Ricard aspect too. I mean, a lot of people were wondering about the Henry signing just because of the fact that, the Ravens rushing offense was already great with Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins and the running backs they had, Justice Hill, Keaton Mitchell. Why did you go and pay $8 million to a running back per season? Well, I think that even though the Ravens running back room and the rushing offense was the best, doesn't mean it can't get better. Doesn't mean that ceiling is there. So you bring in Derrick Henry. This is also, you talk about, first big pure running back since Jamal Lewis, and really bell cow guy. I mean, Derrick Henry's workload I've never seen anything like it. I mean, he's a guy that for his workload has been very healthy. I mean, it is shocking to me the amount of, I can't remember the exact stat. I had crunched this up right after he signed, but for the last 5 years, he's been essentially healthy for most, if not all of the year. In those years, he averaged, I believe, was anywhere from 270 to 310 carries a season. No Ravens running back in that span, even since the Lamar era, I think has had more than 201. I think that was Gus Edwards a couple of years ago. This is going to be Baltimore's first pure bell cow guy in a while, in a really, really long time, where Henry is your bell cow. You're not going to go the committee with Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins or any of those committees anymore. You'll still give Keaton Mitchell carries. You'll still give Justice Hill carries. But Derrick Henry is going to be like, essentially, you're not running the ball 6 times in the AFC Championship game is what that means. So there's going to be a lot that goes on with Henry. But at the end of the day, he, 1, has to stay healthy. 2, has to not hit that 30-year-old wall. But with how he's built and how he runs the football, it's just going to be so difficult for defenses, I feel like, to key in on one or the other of him and Lamar, because with Gus Edwards in the backfield, J.K. Dobbins, if they ran read options, for example, or ran handoffs, play action, there was always going to be some level of gravitation towards a running back, but teams knew that they wanted to stop Lamar Jackson first and foremost, and that was their guy that they were going to key in on. But Derrick Henry, I don't know who you key in on if you're the defense, because now you have to gravitate a bunch towards Henry, but if you do too much, Lamar will burn you. If you gravitate more towards Lamar, Henry will burn you. And Derrick Henry has more of a gravitational pull, honest just because of his size, but just the player who he is, than a Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins. That's no disrespect to those guys, but Henry's just in a different league than most NFL running backs at this point.
He is, and I'm not touting him because he's a Raven now. The guy was a monster at college. I wanted us to draft him out of the league. I mean, out of the NFL draft, back in 2014. But let's just call it how we see it. You alluded to the running back room last year. Gus had 13 touchdowns. That's a fantastic year. He went and got paid. He's over in LA with Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh, and so is J.K. Dobbins. But if you have a chance to line up Derrick Henry behind Lamar Jackson or Gus Edwards, it's a no brainer.
Yeah.
It really is. He's 30 years old, but for the longest time, Ravens fans, myself included, thought the only way Derrick Henry was going to wear a Ravens jersey if it was on Madden. And here we are. I think that's a direct correlation signing, like you said. With Derrick Henry in the AFC Championship game, we're not running the ball 6 times. We're probably running the ball 26 times.
Yeah.
And Derrick Henry probably has 175 yards against Kansas City on that blustery night in January. And not to revisit heartbreak, but we win that football game with Derrick Henry.
Yeah.
It's not revisionist history. It's just the truth.
At least you'd hope so. I don't think anybody was expecting them to run it 6 times with the running backs in the champion. It was a shock to everybody. And again, we're not going to revisit that. That's in the past. But for Baltimore, it always felt like this was the move. They had been super interested at the trade deadline, and they had been kind of keeping their eye on him. And it always feels like when the Ravens want somebody, they always pop up again and again and again until it either happens or they retire. I mean, Clowney was a big target for them for a couple of years, and Des Bryant was rumored to be targeted for them for a couple of years. They bring him in a couple of years ago. So it was a shock. Honestly, they didn't get him at the deadline because there was so much smoke around him, but it just felt like a move that was waiting to happen. Felt like they wanted to be in the big player running back game for a while, whether it was Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, or Henry. But I think Henry was if they were going to make a big move, I think Henry was the right one, just because of the fact that, one, he costs less money than Saquon and Josh Jacobs. And part of that's because he's made NFL money. For Jacobs and Barkley, that this payday was their first NFL payday, not named the fifth year option. I think Henry is still on the level of those guys. But, there are arguments who's better between those, and I think you could argue either way. But in my opinion, you got a top running back, a top 5 back in this league at least, for considerably less per year and considerably less total than the others went for, because it's the age discount, obviously. But part of it too is I think Derrick Henry just wants to win at this point. Not that Barkley or Jacobs doesn't, but I think he was more willing to go to a situation where he understands that he has a shot at a ring, and Baltimore certainly gives him that.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And it remains to be seen what moves are going to be made in this offseason. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of asking you what a schedule prediction is going to be, because it's May 21st and we have a lot of off season left before we even know what this team is going to look like. We have 90. We're not even close to that early August type of thing. It'll be here before we know it.
Oh yeah.
But Kevin, I want to thank you for coming on the show, man. It's been a fantastic hour of football. Always love having you come on. You've been on a bunch now. I know that you have your Locked On Ravens podcast. You're part of the Locked On Sports Network with those guys over there, and you're writing for the Ravens Wire. What do you got coming out this week on your end?
Yeah, we got a bunch. I mean, first of all, I really appreciate you having me on, man. Always a blast talking with you. It's always fun doing these with you. For me, you can find me on Locked On Ravens 5 days a week, talking Ravens daily, about 30 to 45-minute episodes per day. So you can find me over on YouTube. You can like and subscribe over on Locked On Ravens there. Also, if you're an audio form listener, you like to consume your content that way, anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, we have you covered. It's the same show. So however you want to consume or watch or listen, you can do it, and you're not missing out on any content. Plus, at the Ravens Wire, we do a bunch of writing over there. So Ravens centric. With this week, it's OTAs and Jamal Adams schedule release. So again, the NFL never sleeps. The Ravens never do also. And always something to talk about when it comes to this team.
Absolutely. Let everybody know where they can find you on social media before we let you go.
Yeah, you can find me over on Twitter at ChaosStriker34. It's, how if you're watching, it's how it's spelled down below. My last name, I know it's a little bit difficult, but ChaosStriker34 on social media, Twitter, Instagram, the whole 9 yards there.
There you have it, folks. We'll be back tomorrow night for Foul Ball Talk with Tim Malarkey at 8 o'clock. We're going to recap this series with the St. Louis Cardinals. That's a wrap, folks. Kevin, thank you again.
Thanks so much.